They say a man sees a lot in 30 years wearing a badge. I'd seen folks at their worst, their best, and sometimes their most pitiful. I'd locked up drunks who begged for another chance. Men who swore on their mama's grave they didn't do what I saw them do. And good men who made bad choices and regretted every damn second of it. But nothing prepared me for standing in my own kitchen, looking at a bank statement that told me my wife had been living a second life. Clara Price. My wife of 23 years. Tall, sharp, always put together. She had a way of talking that could convince just about anyone that she knew better. And most of the time, she did. I'd never had a head for numbers, and she handled the books, our accounts, the bills, the little things that kept a house running. I trusted her. I never had a reason not to. That changed when Arthur Finch, the town's twitchy little accountant, called me up out of nowhere. Sheriff, I noticed something. Now, maybe it's nothing, but it just didn't sit right with me. Arthur had done my taxes for years. The man was a nervous wreck, always looking over his shoulder like someone was about to club him over the head for misplacing a decimal. I had no reason to think he'd be calling unless something was wrong. Spit it out, Arthur. Well, you see, your wife's business account, it's got some, strange activity. I wasn't snooping. Just, she wrote off some hotel stays, and the payments don't match the client logs I helped her file last quarter. There's airfare, too. Multiple tickets, Sheriff. Look, I shouldn't have called, where? A sharp inhale from the other end of the line. Houston, mostly. A few in Dallas. I didn't say a word for a good 10 seconds. Just listened to the faint scratch of his pen clicking and unclicking on the other end. All right, I said finally. You didn't call me. I hung up before he could answer. I stood there a while, the phone heavy in my hand, staring at the stack of mail on the counter. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint scent of her perfume. Expensive. Floral. The same damn smell that lingered on my shirts when she hugged me in the morning before leaving for business trips. That was the first night I sat on the porch smoking a cigar. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't trust myself to be inside when she got home. The next few weeks I watched, listened, paid attention to things I hadn't before. Clara always had a routine, gym in the morning, meetings, dinners with clients. But now I saw the little shifts. The phone always on silent. The long stares at nothing when she thought no one was watching. The way she'd come home smelling like a place I didn't recognize. I didn't ask her a damn thing. Not yet. I needed more than suspicion. That's when Miss Turner, the town librarian, gave me exactly what I needed. I was walking through town, taking the long way to the station, when she waved me down outside the library, her glasses perched low on her nose. Sheriff Price, you've got a minute? Sure, Miss Turner. What's on your mind? She hesitated, glancing around before stepping closer. I probably shouldn't say anything, but your wife's been coming here a lot lately. I frowned. That a crime? Not at all. But she's not here for the books. A pause. She's been meeting someone. A man. They sit in the back corner, talking real quiet. He's one of those artistic types. Writes poetry, I think. You know the kind. I knew the kind. The kind of man who used words like weapons. Who brooded and whispered sweet nothings to women who didn't get enough of that at home. A man who thought himself deeper than the rest of us. Who looked at hard-working men like me with quiet pity, as if we'd never understand what it meant to feel. Appreciate it, Miss Turner, I said, my voice calm, steady. That evening, Clara came home late, as expected. She set her bag down, kissed my cheek like she always did, and walked toward the bedroom. How was Houston? I asked. She froze for half a second too long. Then, she turned, smiling like I'd asked about the weather. Good. Long meetings. Exhausting. I nodded, looking past her at the mirror in the hallway, at her reflection. Didn't know Houston had poetry readings. Her smile faltered. Just a flicker. I don't know what you mean. I set my coffee down, keeping my eyes on hers. You know exactly what I mean. She inhaled sharply, squared her shoulders. Victor, if you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I cut in, my voice even. I'm telling you. I know. Silence stretched between us, thick as a Texas summer. Finally, she huffed, shaking her head. I don't have time for this, she muttered, turning away. And just like that, she walked off, thinking she still had the upper hand. She didn't. I let her think she did for a little while longer. I took my truck out that night, drove the long roads past the fields, past the places where I'd lived my whole life. Thought about what came next. A younger man might have thrown a fit, might have punched a wall, drank himself stupid. Not me. I'd spent my whole life maintaining order in this town. And I wasn't about to let my own home fall into chaos. No, this wasn't gonna be some emotional mess. I was gonna handle this like a man should. With patience. With control. And when the time came, with finality. The next morning, I went about my routine like nothing had changed. Shaved, put on my uniform, brewed my coffee. Clara was already gone, out the door before I even got out of bed. Early meeting, she'd mumbled. I didn't ask what kind. At the station, I poured myself a fresh cup, nodded at Deputy Jake Foster, and sat down at my desk. Jake was young, eager, still had that fire in his gut that made him want to fix every problem with his fists. He'd learn. The job wasn't about force, it was about knowing when to use it. You look like hell, Sheriff. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Appreciate the concern, I muttered, sipping my coffee. He hesitated. Something wrong. I looked up at him. Tell me, Jake, what would you do if a man walked into your house, sat at your table, and ate your food while looking you in the eye? Jake's brow furrowed. Depends on the man. Let's say he ain't invited. Then I'd put him through the damn wall. I nodded, setting my cup down. That's the difference between you and me. You go straight to the punch. I make sure he leaves knowing he's never welcome again. Jake frowned like he wanted to ask more, but he knew better. Instead, he just nodded and went about his day. I spent the afternoon doing my rounds, stopping by the hardware store to chat with Dan Murphy, checking in with the local diner owner, making sure everything in town was running the way it should. That's what people didn't understand about small towns. You didn't just enforce the law, you made sure folks still trusted it. That meant knowing everyone's business whether they liked it or not. By sunset, I was back at the community center. The place smelled like sawdust and sweat, a few couples already on the dance floor moving to a slow country tune. I nodded to the instructor, a woman in her 60s with a sharp eye and no patience for men with two left feet. You're late, she said, adjusting her glasses. Didn't realize I was on a schedule. She scoffed. Every man who walks in here is on a schedule. What brings you in? Figured it was time I learned. She gave me a look, the kind that said she didn't believe me for a second. But she didn't press. Instead, she clapped her hands. All right, Sheriff, let's see what you got. I stepped onto the floor, awkward at first, but I wasn't here to impress anyone. I was here because Clara had always wanted me to. She used to beg me to dance at weddings, tell me it wasn't about looking good, just about moving. I never listened. Always said it wasn't my thing. Well, maybe it wasn't. But it was now. By the time I got home, Clara was already in bed, lights off, door closed. I stood in the hallway for a second, listening to the silence. It wasn't anger that hit me, not even sadness, just the realization that we'd already been living separate lives long before I found out the truth. The next morning, she was at the table, drinking coffee, scrolling through her phone. I poured myself a cup and sat down across from her. Got plans today? I asked. She didn't look up. Meetings? Houston again? A small pause. No. Dallas. I nodded, taking a sip. You need me to drop you at the airport? That got her attention. She finally looked up, searching my face like she was trying to figure out what I was thinking. No. I'll drive. All right then. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she set her mug down and sighed. Victor, what is this? I raised a brow. Breakfast. She let out a short laugh, but it was forced. You're different lately. I met her eyes. No, Clara. I'm just paying attention. Her mouth opened like she was about to say something, but then she just shook her head and stood up. I need to go. She left without another word. I sat there a while, stirring my coffee, listening to the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway. She thought she was still in control. She wasn't. She just hadn't realized it yet. I had a town to run, a job to finish, and a plan to put in motion. And when it was all said and done, she'd know exactly what it meant to betray a man who had spent his whole life standing tall. The Willow Creek fundraiser was the kind of event that brought out every respectable name in town. Business owners, ranchers, city officials. The kind of people who liked to sip whiskey, talk about the good old days, and pretend their hands had never been dirty. I wasn't much for events like this, but I made a point to be there every year. Not because I liked shaking hands, but because it reminded folks that law and order weren't just ideas, they had a face, and it was mine. This year was different. This year, I had a reason to be there. I stood near the entrance, shaking hands, nodding at familiar faces, keeping my eyes on the room. Clara was already inside, dressed in that dark blue dress she always wore when she wanted to look important. She had a drink in her hand, the polite smile on her face, the kind she wore when she was selling someone something. The man standing next to her, Sebastian Harris, was thinner than I expected. Sharp features, dark clothes, the kind of man who looked like he thought too much and did too little. He wasn't touching her, but he didn't have to. The way they leaned in, the way she laughed just a little too easily, it told me everything. Jake sidled up next to me, nodding toward the scene. That him? That's him. Want me to handle it? I smirked. And what would you do, Jake? Drag him out by his collar? Break his nose? He considered it for a second. Yeah, probably. I shook my head. That's the difference between a hothead and a lawman. You don't teach a man a lesson by beating him. You teach him by making sure he don't forget what he's done. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. Remind me never to piss you off. I clapped him on the shoulder and made my way through the crowd. People greeted me, smiling, offering drinks, talking about property taxes and cattle prices. I answered in short sentences, nodding, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Arthur Finch appeared at my side, nervous as ever, adjusting his tie like it was choking him. Sheriff, it's done. Good. He swallowed hard. Are you sure about this? I looked him dead in the eye. Do I look unsure? He shook his head fast. No, sir. Arthur had done his part, just like I knew he would. A few well-placed emails, a financial report leaked to the right people, a quiet word to the county commissioner about some questionable expenses tied to Clara's firm. Nothing illegal, just enough to make people start whispering. I moved toward the podium at the front of the room. The mayor, a stout man with a thick mustache, finished his speech and gestured toward me. And of course, we'd like to hear from our own Sheriff Price, a man who has dedicated his life to keeping Willow Creek safe. A round of applause. I stepped up, adjusting the microphone. My eyes swept the room. Clara was watching now, her smile frozen, eyes cautious. Sebastian looked bored, swirling the whiskey in his glass like none of this mattered. I cleared my throat. It's been my honor to serve this town for over 30 years. I've seen good men rise, bad men fall, and some men try to play both sides. But there's one thing I know for sure, truth don't stay buried for long. A shift in the room. People leaned in. We talk a lot about integrity in this town, I continued, my voice steady. About loyalty. About standing by your word. A man's reputation, once lost, don't come back easy. And a woman's? Well, let's just say people remember who they trust and who they don't. A few murmurs. Clara's shoulders stiffened. I let the silence settle before I smiled, slow and knowing. Enjoy the evening, folks. I stepped down, shaking hands again, feeling the weight of my words settle over the room like a storm coming in from the west. People started whispering. That's the thing about small towns, secrets don't stay secrets for long, especially when you give them a little push. Jake was waiting by the bar when I reached him, his grin sharp. Damn, Sheriff. That was cold. Cold? I took the drink he handed me. That was just the wind shifting. And sure enough, Clara knew it too. Because when I glanced back, she was already excusing herself, Sebastian following close behind, both of them realizing too late that the ground beneath them wasn't as steady as they thought. I let them leave without a word. No need to stop them. Clara was smart enough to know when a fight wasn't worth having in public. But the real blow hadn't landed yet. That would come later when the weight of what I'd set in motion finally hit her. Jake leaned against the bar, shaking his head as he watched them disappear through the side exit. They're running scared. They should be. I took a sip of my drink, letting the burn settle in my throat. But scared don't mean finished. He frowned. What's next? I set my glass down. We let her see what it feels like to lose everything she thought she controlled. By morning, the whispers in town had turned into full conversations. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Clara's firm was under scrutiny, her name tied to questionable financial moves that people were suddenly paying attention to. Funny how no one cares about an expense report until they're given a reason to. It got worse when I made the call to Tessa. She picked up on the second ring, her voice careful. Dad? Morning, I said. You got time to talk? A pause. I guess. What's wrong? I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. I figured it's time you knew something about your mother. Another pause. A long one. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. Go on. I told her everything. Not the details a daughter didn't need to hear, but enough for her to understand. The trips, the money, the affair. I expected her to get upset, maybe even defend Clara. Instead, she let out a dry laugh. I figured. That surprised me. You did. I didn't know for sure, but it makes sense. She's been distant for years. I stopped trying to figure her out a long time ago. There was a sadness in her voice, but not the kind that begged for sympathy. Tessa had made her peace with the distance between them, something I should have seen earlier. What do you want me to do? She asked. I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. Nothing. Just wanted you to hear it from me. She let out a breath. Appreciate it. I hesitated. And Tessa? Yeah? Don't let her make you feel guilty when she comes crying. Another pause. She already tried that years ago. The call ended and I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. One more thing Clara couldn't control. By noon I got another call. This one from Arthur Finch, his voice high and panicked. She knows, Sheriff. She came to my office, yelling, demanding to know where the leak came from. I didn't say anything, but I don't think she believed me. She won't do anything, I said, calm. She's got more to lose than you. Arthur exhaled sharply. I hope you're right. I was. Clara was too careful to lash out. She might scream, she might throw a fit, but she wasn't about to make a public scene when she was already under scrutiny. The real trouble wasn't her. It was Sebastian. That evening I pulled into the diner for coffee, took my usual seat near the window. 5 minutes later, Sebastian walked in. He didn't notice me at first, too busy looking over his shoulder like a man who knew he was running out of places to hide. I let him sit at the counter, order his coffee before I made my move. Sliding onto the stool beside him, I tapped the counter twice. He tensed before turning his head, his eyes wary. Sheriff. Sebastian. He swallowed. Something I can do for you? I gave him a long look. Up close, he wasn't much to be afraid of. Just a man who thought he was smarter than he was. You planning on sticking around? He hesitated. I don't know what you mean. I smiled slow. Sure you do. His fingers tightened around his cup. Look, I didn't mean. I don't care what you meant, I cut in. I care what you're gonna do now. He blinked, his throat bobbing as he tried to keep his composure. Look, Clara and this isn't what you think. It's exactly what I think, I said, voice even. And it's over. He stiffened. She's a grown woman. She makes her own choices. I leaned in just a little. She does. But see, you made a choice too. You came into my town, put your hands on my wife, and thought there wouldn't be consequences. He swallowed hard. I don't care if you walk out of here and never come back, or if you stay and watch everything around you crumble. But let me give you some advice, Sebastian. I reached for my coffee, took a slow sip. If I were you, I'd get the hell out while I still had a choice. He stared at me, breathing shallow. I didn't move, didn't blink. Just let the silence stretch until it did exactly what I wanted it to, make him realize he was already beaten. He stood abruptly, throwing a few bills on the counter before walking out, his steps stiff and hurried. I finished my coffee, nodded at the waitress, and walked back to my truck. One down. One to go. 2 days later, Sebastian was gone. He didn't make a scene about it, didn't try to fight back. Just packed his things and ran like a man who knew he'd overstayed his welcome. Someone saw him loading up his car outside the little rental on the edge of town, looking over his shoulder like he expected to see me standing there with my arms crossed. Good. He should've. But Clara? She wasn't going anywhere. That wasn't her style. She'd spent too many years building herself into what she thought was untouchable. She didn't run. She tried to salvage. That morning I was at the station when Jake came in, shaking his head. Your wife's at the cafe, Sheriff. Talking loud. I looked up from my paperwork. That's so? Oh yeah. He dropped into the chair across from my desk, arms crossed. Saying you're out to ruin her, playing dirty. I chuckled slow. Ain't playing if it's the truth. She's also saying you embarrassed her in front of the whole town. I leaned back in my chair. She embarrassed herself. Jake grinned. What's your next move? I took my time answering. No need to rush a man when he already held the cards. By noon, I was standing on the porch of my daughter's house, knocking twice before the door swung open. Tessa took one look at me and sighed. I figured you'd show up. You talked to your mother. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. If you mean, did I get a call where she tried to spin this whole thing into being your fault, then yeah. She called. And? Tessa smirked. I hung up. I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, exactly, just confirmation that I'd raised her right. She always said you were the problem, she said after a pause. Too stubborn. Too much of a relic. But it turns out you're the only one still standing. Comes with the job. She studied me for a second, then opened the door wider. Come in. Coffee's fresh. That evening, Clara showed up at my door. She knocked twice, sharp and quick, and when I didn't answer fast enough, she knocked again. I took my time opening it, leaning against the frame when I did. Clara. She had a look on her face like she wanted to be angry but hadn't quite figured out how to spin it to her advantage. We need to talk. I nodded toward the porch swing. Go on then. She stepped past me, heels clicking against the wood, arms crossed over her chest like she was about to deliver a lecture. I stayed standing, arms loose at my sides. This isn't fair, Victor, she started. I almost laughed. Fair? Yes, fair, she snapped. You've made me out to be some kind of villain. You've turned people against me. I exhaled slow. No, Clara. You did that yourself. She shook her head, frustrated. You think you've won, don't you? There ain't no winning here, I said, voice even. There's just consequences. Her jaw tightened. I made a mistake. I nodded once. You sure did. She scoffed. That's all you have to say? What do you want me to say, Clara? I gestured to the town stretching beyond us, to the people who'd already made up their minds about what kind of woman she was. You want me to tell you it's gonna be okay? That I'll forget about it? That we'll just go back to how things were? For the first time, her anger faltered. I didn't come here to beg, she said, but her voice wasn't as sharp as before. No, you came here to see if there was anything left to salvage, I said. There ain't. Silence stretched between us, the only sound the wind pushing through the trees. Finally, she let out a breath, one that sounded a hell of a lot like defeat. So that's it? I nodded. That's it. She turned then, walking down the steps without another word, her shoulders stiff, her back straight. Always composed, always in control, except this time she had nothing left to control. And I stood there, watching her go, knowing I wasn't the one who lost something. She was. 2 weeks passed. Clara stayed in town, but she kept her distance. The few times I saw her, she was moving fast, head high, trying to act like nothing had changed. But it had. Folks weren't unkind, but they weren't warm either. That was the thing about small towns, you didn't have to be run out. You just had to be ignored long enough to realize you didn't belong anymore. I wasn't waiting for the day she packed up and left. I didn't care either way. My concern ended the moment she stepped off my porch that night. What I had left was mine to rebuild, and I wasn't wasting time looking back. I spent my mornings at the station, finishing paperwork, tying up loose ends. I wasn't sheriff for much longer, and I knew it. I could feel it in my bones, the way the job sat heavier than it used to. I wasn't slowing down, just getting ready to step aside. Jake was coming into his own, and I let him take lead more often. He had the makings of a damn good sheriff, once he learned patience. One afternoon, he leaned against the doorframe of my office, watching me sort through old case files. So, what are you gonna do when you finally hang it up? I glanced up. Haven't decided yet. He smirked. You'll be bored inside a week. Maybe. He didn't push. Just nodded like he understood. That evening, I drove out to the community hall where the dance classes were still running. I'd kept going, not for anyone else, but for myself. There was something steadying about it, about the way it forced you to move, to pay attention. I didn't have a regular partner, but I danced anyway. Getting better, Sheriff, the instructor said after one of the sets. Wouldn't take much, I admitted. She chuckled. You ain't half as bad as you think. I nodded my Victors, stepping outside for some air. The sun was sinking low, the Texas sky burning orange. I lit a cigar, taking a slow drag, watching the smoke curl upward. I felt something then, not relief, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that everything was as it should be. Tomorrow would come, and I'd get up, put my boots on, and face it like I always had. The past was behind me. And I was still standing. Clara left town on a Sunday morning. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just packed up her things and went. I was sitting at the diner when I heard. Linda, the waitress, poured my coffee and nodded toward the window. Your ex-wife just drove past. Looked like she had the whole damn house stuffed in that car. I didn't turn to look. Just took a sip of coffee. That's so? She smirked. Didn't even stop for breakfast. Guess she ain't got many friends left. I nodded. Guess not. That was it. No long speeches, no final dramatic showdown. Just a woman realizing the world she built was made of sand and the tide had finally come in. She tried to fight it, tried to hold on, but at the end of the day, she did what she always did, chose herself. Jake slid into the seat across from me, grabbing a menu. Figured she'd be gone sooner. She held on as long as she could. She tell you she was leaving? Nope. He snorted. Fitting. I glanced out the window, watching the dust settle where her car had been. She might land on her feet somewhere else, but that wasn't my problem. I had my own life to worry about. The next week, I handed in my resignation. The town threw a gathering at the station, nothing fancy, just barbecue and cold beer, a few speeches about duty and service. The mayor handed me a plaque. Jake gave me a new cigar cutter with my initials engraved on the side. People shook my hand, patted my back, told me I'd earned the rest. Dan Murphy, the hardware store owner, leaned against the wall next to me as the night wound down. So, what's next for Victor Price? Thinking about building a cabin. He raised a brow. That right? Yeah. Got a piece of land out near the lake. Figure I'll keep my hands busy. He nodded approvingly. Good way to spend your time. Better than sitting around waiting to die. He chuckled. Fair enough. Over the next few months, I did just that. Bought the materials, got my hands dirty, started putting together something that was mine alone. I didn't rush. Didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, there wasn't any urgency, no clock ticking in the background. Tessa started visiting more. At first, it was just to check in, make sure I hadn't lost my mind out there in the woods. Then it became routine. Sunday coffee, catching up, laughing at old stories. We never talked about Clara. No need to. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch overlooking the lake, she glanced at the half-finished railing. You need help with that? I smirked. You know how to use a drill? She smirked right back. I know how to read the instructions. We worked side by side, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had my family back. Not because we forced it, not because we ignored what had happened, but because we both knew what mattered and what didn't. On the night I finished the cabin, I lit a fire, poured a glass of whiskey, and sat back in my chair. No regrets. No bitterness. Just the satisfaction of knowing I'd done things my way. Clara had taken what she could and walked away empty-handed. Sebastian had slithered off into whatever hole he crawled out of. The town was still standing, and so was I. Jake stopped by the next morning, whistling as he looked around. Damn, Sheriff. You really built this yourself. Figured if I can keep a town in line for 30 years, I can handle a few 2x4s. He grinned. Hell of a way to move forward. I took a slow sip of coffee, looking out over the land, the lake, the steady morning sun. Only way I know how. And that was the end of it. No looking back. No second chances. Just a man standing tall, ready for whatever came next.